In this episode, we're going to be talking about ISO values and how to use them.
AdoramaTV presents Exploring Photography with Mark Wallace, where you will learn innovative techniques on shooting a wide range of photography. Here's your host.
Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on AdoramaTV, brought to you by Adorama. It's the camera store that has everything for photographers like you and me. Well, if you've been shooting for a while, you know that there's the exposure triangle that's made up of the shutter, the aperture, and ISO. And we know that we can use the shutter to control motion and the aperture to control depth of field, but in all of our discussions, somehow ISO seems to be left out. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about ISO, what it is, how you use it, which settings to use, and why sometimes having a really high ISO value isn't such a bad thing. But before we get into all of that, I want to remind you that Adorama has some terrific contests. If you enter the contest, you can win some great prizes. So click on the link and check them out. ISO determines how sensitive your camera is to light. The higher the ISO value, the less light you'll need to take a photo. Let's take a look at this animation and see exactly how this works. Let's say we have a room that's lit with 128 light bulbs. Let's also pretend that we have a proper exposure at ISO 100, shooting at f2.8, and a shutter speed of 60. Remember, I'm just making up these values to illustrate a point. At ISO 200, we could get the same result with only 64 light bulbs. At ISO 400, we'd only need 32 light bulbs. At ISO 800, that number would fall to 16 lights. Each time we double our ISO value, we only need half as much light. So ISO 1600 would only need 8 lights. If we double our ISO again, we can half the amount of light that we need. ISO 3200, 4 lights. ISO 6400, 2 lights. And at ISO 12,800, we'd only need 1 light bulb, and we could still shoot at f2.8 and 1/60th of a second. That is a huge difference from 128 lights at ISO 100 to just 1 little light at ISO 12,800. All right, so the question is, why wouldn't you always have your ISO set to a high ISO value? Well, the answer is noise. Noise is sort of hard to explain, but it's easy to see, so let's take a look. Here's an image shot at ISO 100. Now notice that everything looks clean. Now here's the same image shot at ISO 12,800. You can see the grain in this image, and that grain is called noise. Noise is the trade-off. Higher ISO values have more noise. Well, in the past, photographers have always been told to keep their ISO values as low as possible to get noise-free images. We still want to do that today, but the good news is that there have been huge technological advances with digital cameras, and now there are all kinds of cameras that can shoot at ISO 3200 and even higher. In fact, I think that the groundbreaking camera was the Nikon D3X, and then along came the 5D Mark III from Canon, and then sort of the floodgates were open. Now there are all kinds of cameras that can shoot at high ISOs with almost zero noise. And the question is, what can your camera do? Well, it's easy to figure out. Let me show you how to do it. Get in a room with low light and shoot a series of images, increasing your ISO with each shot. Then take a look at the photos at full resolution on your computer, and you'll know what ISO value is the max for your camera. If ISO 6400 has too much noise for your taste, but ISO 3200 looks good, then ISO 3200 is your camera's maximum acceptable ISO value. The rule of thumb still holds true. You want to keep your ISO values as low as possible because you don't want to introduce noise in your images if you don't have to. But because our cameras are advanced now, in low light, increasing your ISO can really help you out. So in low light, don't be afraid to crank up the ISO because that can keep your shutter speeds fast, and that can really improve your low light photography. Let's take a look. Let's say we're in a room with low light and we don't have a flash, and we're taking photos of some kids at a birthday party. We've set our camera to aperture priority mode, and we're shooting at ISO 100 at f2.8. Our camera is telling us our shutter speed is 1/15th of a second. That's no good at all. Our photos are going to come out totally blurry. Now, even if we had a tripod, those kids are going to move around and our photos will stink. We don't want that. Let's increase our ISO and see what happens. At ISO 200, our shutter speed will be 1/30th of a second, and at ISO 400, our shutter speed will be 1/60th of a second. And at ISO 800, we'd be shooting at 1/125th of a second. Now that's fast enough to freeze those kids. We could even boost our ISO to 1600 to shoot at 250th of a second, just to be sure. One of my favorite features is called Auto ISO. That's when you want to work really fast and you're not quite certain what ISO value you should use. So let's take the example of shooting a birthday party with kids in really low light. I might want to shoot at an aperture value, let's say of f8, and a shutter speed around 250 to freeze all the motion. But what ISO value should I use? Well, I don't have to know that. All I have to do is put my camera into auto ISO mode, and my camera's gonna figure that out for me. So I'd put my camera in manual mode, set it to f8, set it to 250th of a second, and start taking pictures. My ISO is going to change for a correct exposure every time. It's really awesome. Now, sometimes the ISO might go higher than you might want, and you're gonna get noisy images, but in my opinion, I'd rather have noisy images that I can use than a blurry image that I have to throw away. Well, I hope you learned a little bit about ISO today, and I thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget that you can zip over to the Adorama Learning Center. There are hundreds of photography tutorials. You can learn all about shooting in manual mode and learn about the exposure triangle and some of the things that we talked about today. So check that out. And also don't forget that you can subscribe to Adorama TV totally free. So click the link and subscribe today. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.
Do you want great looking prints at low cost? Be sure to visit our easy to use online printing service. Adorama Pix has professionals who treat your images with the utmost care that you can count on. For a quick turnaround on photos, cards, or albums, use AdoramaPix.com.